Today we're going to be looking at stress, but through a very specific lens, the traffic light processing framework.
We often think of stress as this big, bad thing, something we should avoid at all costs. But actually, that's not the whole story.
Believe it or not, a bit of activation can actually help the brain get going and really sharpen its focus. It's why a looming deadline can sometimes be just the push we need to finally start that task.
The trouble really starts, though, when our system begins to depend on stress as its main source of fuel. So for many people, especially those who are AuDHD, you have to ask, what is the real cost of relying on stress, not just as a one-off motivator, but as a default way of operating?
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we need a kind of map, a map of how the brain responds. And that's exactly what the traffic light processing framework gives us.
So what is traffic light processing? Well, it's a way of understanding stress, not just as a feeling, but as a real biological shift happening in the brain. It helps us visualize how much of our brain's processing map is actually available to us at any point in time.
This framework breaks the nervous system down into 3 distinct states. First, there's green, where the system has regulated open capacity. Then you have orange, where the system is in a state of activated, narrowed capacity. And finally, there's red, where the system is in a survival-based state and capacity becomes severely narrowed.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. When stress becomes chronic, it starts to interfere with the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain that handles things like planning and regulating our emotions. Using the traffic light processing analogy, it's like the driver of the system starts to lose access to their own map.
So that leads to a crucial question. Why does this narrowing of capacity happen in the first place? Well, the key concept here is something called stacked load.
You see, especially for many neurodivergent people, stress isn't just one isolated thing. It's more like a combination of different demands. And every single one of those demands takes up a bit of processing capacity, adding more and more weight, more load onto the whole system. And this load comes from all sorts of places, many of which are completely invisible from the outside. We're talking about things like processing sensory input, figuring out social cues, and the sheer effort of masking, that constant work of trying to conceal neurodivergent traits. It all adds up to a huge cumulative weight.
This quote really hits the nail on the head. It explains so perfectly why a seemingly small thing can trigger such a huge, overwhelming response. That one small thing isn't the real problem. It's just the final cone placed on a road that was already getting narrower and narrower.
So what happens when that cumulative load just becomes too much? What happens when those roads close off completely? Well, that's what we call burnout.
Think about it. As the brain's available capacity shrinks, so do the options it can see. The neural network literally starts closing off pathways, which makes the brain much more reactive and a lot less flexible in how it responds to things.
And here's the crucial point. When the nervous system gets stuck in a cycle of high activation, spending too much time in those orange and red states, without enough time to recover, the end result is often burnout.
It is so important to understand this. Burnout has nothing to do with being lazy or lacking willpower. It's a biological reality. It's what happens when the nervous system simply runs out of resources. It's a state of complete physiological exhaustion.
Now, I know this might all sound a bit grim, but here's the good news. Once you understand the mechanism, it opens up a whole new strategy, one that's all about learning how to widen that neural map again.
Right, so the first thing to get clear on is that the goal here isn't to get rid of stress completely. That's impossible and frankly, not even desirable. Stress is just a fundamental part of how our brains work.
No, the real goal is to manage our capacity. It's about learning how to use that activation intentionally on our own terms, while at the same time actively protecting and rebuilding our system's resources.
And you can see the contrast so clearly here. On the one hand, stress narrows that neural map. It closes and diverts roads, and it forces us to rely on our most basic survival circuits. But recovery does the exact opposite. It widens the map, it brings our executive functions back online, and it reopens and even builds new roads. So how can we actually do this? How do we widen the map? Well, the strategy has a few key parts. It's about spotting the signs of narrowing early on. It's about using activation intentionally, not just reactively. And it's about building in consistent, reliable recovery time. That also means making a conscious effort to reduce sensory load and truly prioritizing rest.
Ultimately, it all comes down to this one very powerful idea. Stress is what closes and diverts the roads in our brain,
But recovery is what reopens them, giving us back access to our full capacity.